All right, Sputnik 1. The Russian satellite that scared Americans because it seemed like the Russians were ahead of us when it comes to technology, space technology, which would equate to nuclear technology, just really scared a lot of people. It was launched on October 4th, 1957. It became the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It was a metallic sphere about 2 feet across, weighing 184 pounds, with long, what they called whiskers here, pointing to one side, and stayed in orbit for 6 months before falling back to Earth. Its rocket boosters weighed 4 tons and also reached orbit and was easily visible from the ground, and it made a beeping sound as it went by. So people in the United States could both see it and hear it as it went by, which scared a lot of people because in Americans' minds, it was, well, why couldn't the Russians then turn around and put a nuclear warhead on one of these satellites and have it hit anywhere in the country? Before the launch of Sputnik and the fear of long-range nuclear missiles, it was thought that there were certain places that could be hit along the East Coast or West Coast of the United States. But if you lived in the middle of the United States, it was virtually impossible. You're protected and you couldn't be hit by nuclear bombs or anything like that. Well, that comfort level of the Midwesterners was shattered once Sputnik was launched, and they both saw and heard it go over the skies in places like Iowa and Kansas. So there was a lot of concern, and the big thing was it just appeared to Americans like the Russians were ahead of us now. This race to have nuclear weapons and technology, they appeared to be winning. Was it really true? No, really wasn't, but people feared that. Scientists in the Sputnik 2, scientists in the Soviet Union were sure that organisms from Earth could live in space. To demonstrate, they sent the world's second artificial space satellite, Sputnik 2, with a dog in there to see if the dog could survive in space, if they could launch and have people survive in there. And yeah, it was successful. The Camp David talks, Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to Camp David, which is a presidential retreat in Maryland. And it was actually named after David Eisenhower, the son of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who passed away at an early age. It says here, one of the Eisenhower's greatest presidential accomplishments was his success at keeping America at peace throughout the Cold War. When Khrushchev visited America in 1959, he and Eisenhower seemed to get along so well that it seemed a thaw in the Cold War was possible. But Khrushchev would end up scuttling the Paris Peace Conference the following year after the Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over the airspace. The U-2 incident was Eisenhower's greatest embarrassment and disappointment as a president. Khrushchev confronted Eisenhower and said, "We shot down one of your U-2 spy planes that was spying on us in the Soviet Union." And Eisenhower denied it, and which was a bad idea because Khrushchev said, "Well, we have proof." And they had actually had Gary Powers in captivity, and they had the wreckage from his U-2 spy plane right there. He was convicted of espionage. Gary Powers was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 7 years of hard labor. He only served 1 year and 9 months and 9 days before being traded for a Soviet spy, Colonel Rudolf Ivanovich Abel. And there's Gary Powers and his U-2 spy plane right there. Okay, let's talk about Cuba and communism, which was big, because remember, Cuba is a mere 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And communism being instituted in a place that's so close to the United States was a big concern for obvious reasons. Latin American countries always resented the United States giving billions of dollars to Europe compared to millions to Latin America. They thought they deserved more. And they always regretted and hated the fact that the United States was continually intervening in Latin American countries. And so in 1959, Fidel Castro instituted communism and struck up a relationship with the Soviet Union. And Americans were really unhappy about that. In 1961, America then broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. Only recently have those diplomatic relations been reinstituted. We'll talk about what happened here after the 1960 election. In 1960, the Republicans nominated former Vice President Richard Nixon and the Democrats John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was young. He was vibrant. He was actually Catholic. His vice president was Lyndon Baines Johnson, who he put on the ticket to get Southern support. LBJ was from Texas. So JFK hoped to get the support of Texas by having LBJ be his vice president, and it worked. Kennedy was attacked because he was the first Catholic presidential candidate ever, but defended himself and encouraged Catholics to vote for him, which they did. And really, JFK is able to win this election in 1960 because of this presidential debate right here. It was televised. Millions of people saw it. People loved how young and energetic Kennedy was. He didn't look like your run-of-the-mill president, whereas Nixon did. Nixon was coming off a bad flu. He was, weak. He didn't look good. He had bags under his eyes, and then he's going against this young guy who's, who had a really good showing, surprisingly good showing. If you listen to this on the radio, the debate, those people said that Nixon won. If you saw it on TV, because of the allure of Kennedy, it appeared that he won. Well, at the end of the day, the presidential election, you could see here that Nixon is going to lose to the young Kennedy. So Kennedy, president, 1960. So let's talk a little bit about Eisenhower's legacy as president. He ended the Korean War and kept the United States out of a war with Russia. 1959, both Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th state in the Union. Eisenhower did little for civil rights, with the exception of the whole Little Rock, Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine. He intervened there, so that was pretty big. But other than that, he wasn't a huge civil rights advocate. He escalated the nuclear threat. Actually, he wanted to come in and reduce the number of weapons, reduce the number of airplanes, use massive retaliation, and 7 or 8 super bombers and 7 or 8 nuclear weapons. They would save money, and hey, we'll be done, and we don't have to keep spending all this money on weapons and whatnot. Well, that's actually the opposite of what happened. He created what's known as a military industrial complex that we still have today. The military and industry getting together and creating weapons. Like today, we have factories that just produce weapons, that just produce airplanes, that for war, that just produce, nuclear weapons and whatnot. Eisenhower was the one who actually created this military industrial complex. And very ironic that on his way out, he warned against a military industrial complex that seemed to be growing at that time. He's warning against what he has created. So a little bit about Eisenhower's legacy. He did definitely remain popular after his presidency, mostly because of his contributions to World War II. There's a picture of the signing in 59, Alaska becoming the 49th state, and there's Hawaii becoming the 50th state there. JFK, when he became president, surrounded himself with a very diverse and eclectic cabinet. People, labor leaders, business leaders, you name it. He just was like, I'm not going to do the same run-of-the-mill cabinet type position. The people that have been used before. He wanted to go and get some people from the outside, like. There's a number of them that we'll be talking about, like Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was involved in the car industry before and then became Secretary of Defense and did a pretty good job. A little bit about JFK. He was young. We know that. He's the youngest president ever elected. The youngest president ever was TR, but he became president after the death of McKinley, the assassination of McKinley. In his JFK's inaugural address, the famous quote, "Ask not what your country could do for you, but what you can do for your country." He uttered that phrase, and then he followed it up with the creation of what's called the Peace Corps, where we would, instead of sending just boatloads of money, we wanted to send our best and our brightest, our young people, to go and help underdeveloped countries. So He really stepped it up with the Peace Corps. He was a graduate of Harvard, and he was from Boston, and he had that Boston accent. There he is sailing. There he is with his son. They called him John John. Tragically died in an airplane crash about 14, 15 years ago. There's Bill Clinton meeting his hero, JFK. There's JFK with his wife, Jackie. There's a picture of Jackie right there. She's a very pretty first lady. Well, and then there's the whole Marilyn Monroe thing. We'll talk a little bit more in class about the exploits of JFK. Are very, very well known. He was well known as a guy who would oftentimes cheat on his wife a lot. And one of the women he cheated with was Marilyn Monroe. There he is with the Peace Corps right here, addressing the Peace Corps here, meeting some of them. And there he is with Eleanor Roosevelt talking about the Peace Corps. Let's talk about what his goals were politically. You know, you've had presidents that have been naming, it all started with TR naming their economic plans, their domestic home plans, whether it be Square Deal, a new frontier was what JFK called his, right? You had things like the New Freedom was Wilson, Square Deal was TR, Wilson's was New Freedom. We know Taft was dollar diplomacy. FDR was New Deal. Truman was Fair Deal. And now you've got, and Eisenhower was dynamic conservatism, and JFK's is New Frontier. New Frontier, again, was a very, very New Deal-ish. He's a continuation of the New Deal and the Fair Deal. Things that he proposed that were unique, Medicare and Medicaid, which would be insurance to the elderly and insurance to those who were at the poverty level who didn't make that much money. Medicare, Medicaid, we still have them today. He tried to keep a lid on wages to fight creeping inflation that was happening at this time. He wanted to cut taxes and put money in people's hands. That was his goal. Cut taxes, have high taxes, and put money in people's hands to stimulate the economy. A lot of his programs like Medicare and Medicaid, aid to education, including Catholic education, got stalled in Congress because of a lot of different things politically. Also, JFK wanted, part of his New Frontier program was to land a man on the moon, which excited a lot of people. And eventually we did. Obviously, he wasn't around at the time. He was, you know, obviously killed, assassinated, and didn't have the opportunity to see what became of it. Apollo 11. Some facts on Apollo 11 that are kind of cool. July 20th, 1969, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong became the first humans to walk on the moon. They spent 2.5 hours on the moon's surface collecting 47 pounds of lunar material. Michael Collins piloted the command spacecraft alone in lunar orbit until Armstrong and Aldrin returned to it just under a day later for the trip back to Earth. Apollo 11 left Florida on July 16th, arrived on the moon on the 20th of July, and landed in the Pacific Ocean on the 28th. So altogether, they're gone for 12 days. Let's talk about Kennedy and his relationship with Khrushchev. At first, Khrushchev attempted to bully the young president, thinking that I could take advantage of this guy because he's so young, but JFK refused to back down. In August of 1961, the Soviet Union began building the Berlin Wall to separate East and West Berlin. And here's what it looked like. The wall was built here in this area. They could build it on this side because if you remember, Berlin is totally surrounded 100% by East Germany. So they built the wall all the way around to keep Easterners from jumping the fence, going over and escaping to West Berlin. Here's the construction of the Berlin Wall here. Some facts, some information about the Berlin Wall and how guarded and protected it is. At any time, you could pause this and read a lot of this. The dimensions, the steel spikes covered the ground between the walls, 14 centimeters long. It was known as Stalin's lawn. Replacing massive retaliation was Kennedy's flexible response. He said, you know, no way, massive retaliation just doesn't work. This was a defense strategy of Secretary of Defense McNamara, who pushed a strategy of flexible response, which developed an array of military options that could match the gravity of whatever crisis came to hand. Right? Instead of just threatening to just obliterate a country if something small happened, they have special ops like Green Berets, Army Rangers, and you know, special operation forces like that. JFK in Vietnam, the American-backed South Vietnamese Diem was the leader there, backed by the United States. But it was always shaky. In 1954, it was threatened by the Viet Cong movement by Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Cong were the communist group within South Vietnam. The North Vietnam was communist. So it was North Vietnam and the Viet Cong together versus the South Vietnam and the United States is what it's going to amount to. JFK is ordered an increase in military advisors, and there's quotes around advisors in Vietnam. He becomes the first president to send men over there. Not so much for the purpose of fighting, but more for advising. Okay, JFK's Alliance for Progress was dubbed the Marshall Plan for Latin America. So throw a bunch of money at Latin America in response to Cuba and communism. That was a big reason for the Alliance for Progress was, man, people were scared because Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, you know, and you know, just evidence of that people were right to be concerned was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is how it started. It was April 17th, 1961, approximately 1,300 members of a CIA-sponsored counter-revolutionary Cuban exile force stormed the beaches of Cuba. This was a group in 61 that was released by JFK. However, it was an Eisenhower plan, but JFK just inherited it, so he continued on with it. The CIA was supposed to train these Cuban exiles who were kicked off the island because they didn't support Castro. They were supposed to train them, and they were going to invade. And the thought process was that so many people were upset in Cuba about the harsh government, communist government that was instituted there, that they would turn on their own government and help these Cuban exiles and that were trained by the CIA. Well, it was a disaster. You know, the group, just the Bay of Pigs invasion, that nobody turned on the government. They captured the Cuban exiles. They killed a lot of them. They put them in prisons, and it was just a complete and utter disaster early in the presidency of JFK. Very embarrassing for him. But what it did cause is it caused Castro to then turn around and run to the Soviet Union for help. And the Soviet Unions were more than willing to help them. In fact, what better place to put nuclear weapons and point them at Washington, D.C., just as the United States was using Greece and Turkey to put nuclear weapons pointed at Moscow. So this was an opportunity for the Soviet Union to get back at the United States through Cuba. So they did. They sent nuclear weapons and put them in Cuba, pointed them at Washington, D.C., and the American airplanes that were flying over Cuba spotted it, and it was on. It led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are pictures that were taken by a U-2 spy plane, and you know, firing tables and tents where they would house these nuclear missiles. And then when the Americans found out about it, they when the president found out about it, he put an embargo around Cuba, didn't let any ships in or out. There were threats going back and forth. There was at one point, it was dangerously close to nuclear annihilation. People in the United States were freaking out and thinking that the world could end at any second. But eventually there was a threat, and I'll get into this a little bit more in class. There was eventually there was a decision made. There was both sides, after almost annihilating each other, took a chill pill, kind of, so to speak. And there was an agreement made between both sides that eventually the Soviet Union would take those missiles out. In return, the Americans had a promise that they would not invade Cuba, and that they would at some point take their missiles away from Greece and Turkey, and the whole thing dissipated. But they put a teletype hotline, they called it, in a quick communication system between Moscow and Washington, D.C., to avoid any kind of mistakes that could be made or nuclear annihilation could happen. The hotline, it was called. When it comes to JFK and civil rights, he promoted civil rights. That was something that he very much wanted. He didn't do much in his first couple years as president. Most people believe that in his second term that he would have done a lot more. He was afraid that if he did do some of the things that he talked about, that he would lose the support of the South in his New Frontier program. So he kind of held off on it. Unfortunately, his assassination happened, and he wasn't able to do a lot of the things that he promised. But LBJ will do some of those things. Things that were happening during his time, the Freedom Riders were going down into the South and demonstrating against segregation in the transportation systems, spurred on by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. The Voter Education Projects was an attempt to register African Americans in the South. Also, the United States sent 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to ensure that James Meredith could enroll in the first class at University of Mississippi. They were met with resistance, much like the Little Rock Nine. And in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King launched a peaceful campaign against discrimination, and he and his followers were attacked with high pressure hoses from fire hydrants. On June 11th, 1963, JFK made a speech urging immediate action towards this, what he called a moral issue, in a plea for peace. He didn't come out specifically and say against discrimination, but he called it a moral issue. So he's kind of, talking around the subject. This attack here in Anniston, Alabama was horrific. The Freedom Riders bus, the Greyhound bus, was attacked. Molotov cocktail was thrown into the bus. And the men that were outside were attacked with baseball bats when they ran off the bus because it was on fire. It was just a horrific event. Here's with James Meredith enrolling in Ole Miss. It was on Sunday afternoon, September 30th, 1962. James Meredith arrived on campus accompanied by a federal entourage that included over 120 marshals. The result was a night-long riot that resulted in 2 deaths, 175 injuries, and 212 arrests. Despite one of the most violent challenges to federal authority since the Civil War, Meredith was quietly registered the next day. Enduring taunts and abuse from many of his fellow students, in August 1963, Meredith became the first Black graduate of the University of Mississippi. And there's James Meredith right there, and there's the lieutenant governor that tried to block his entrance in, which he failed to do. Later on, in 1966, 3 years after his graduation, it was June 5th, he started a solitary march against fear. He was going to walk from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Tennessee, protesting things like racism, and he was shot in the leg shortly after his walk began. When they heard the news, other civil rights campaigners, including Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Floyd McKissick, decided to continue the march in Meredith's name. One of the most well-known civil rights events in history was Martin Luther King's March on Washington, D.C. It was August 28th, 1963, an estimated 250,000 people, about a quarter of whom were white, marched from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial in what turned out to be both a protest and a communal celebration. The heavy police presence turned out to be unnecessary, as the march was noted for its civility and peacefulness. The march was extensively covered by the media with live international television coverage. And this is Martin Luther King right here. So you could see him giving his "I Have a Dream" speech at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, again, I'm going to get into this a little bit more in class, but it was November 22nd, 1963, when JFK was gunned down by supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald, who later on was shot by Jack Ruby out on his way to being arraigned in court. This led to much controversy and speculation, and it continues to this day about a conspiracy. Was it a conspiracy? Was it not a conspiracy? Was it the CIA? Was it not the CIA? Was it the mob? Was it not the mob? The fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court came out and said that it was the act of a single shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, and he did not have ties to the mob or to the Soviet Union or to the CIA. Here is the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president. Here's Dealey Plaza right down here where it happened. It happened about here's the book depository right here. Here's where he was on the 6th floor. And here's where he shot the president right there at Dealey Plaza. We'll talk more about this in class. There's the window that Booth shot the president from. There's the grassy knoll. If you know anything about the conspiracy that I'll be talking about in class, they thought that they heard or saw a second shooter on the other side of this grassy knoll. And they thought that there's no way that someone could fire a rifle as accurately and as quickly as Booth did. He was in the military and he was trained. Shameless self-promotion. Here is me at Dealey Plaza. You can see that X right there. That's where where Kennedy was shot and killed. And there, I took this picture. There's the 6th floor right up there, right here. This is where he shot the president. And there's me at Dealey Plaza right by the X. Those who believe that there's no way that it could have been the act of a single shooter, it had to be a conspiracy, it had to be more than one, say there's no way a bullet could be shot from this angle, go through the president's shoulder, through the seat, through the shoulder, through the neck, out into the seat in front, through Governor Conley, who was with him. He was in the front seat, through his arm, through his wrist, and lodge into his leg. They call it the magic bullet theory, and they think it was more than one shooter. Here is Jack Ruby right here, who said that he saw what was happening on TV and decided, and he was so distraught by the death of the president that he went down and he shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. He shot him in the stomach and killed him. That led to more conspiracy theories about, was he, with the mob, and they wanted to silence Oswald before he could talk. Here's a picture with Lee Harvey Oswald, who married a Russian woman and also spent time in Russia, which also contributed to theories that it was the Russians that killed him. And there's the swearing in of LBJ. This is the day after the killing of Kennedy. This is Jackie Kennedy there at the swearing in. She's wearing the same outfit that she wore the previous day. It's bloodstained down below where her hands are. And that's the end of chapter.